Alright, welcome everybody to another mixing video. Today we're going to be looking at mixing bass guitar, and it was requested of me that I specifically cover bass DI with a bass amp. Okay, so for this session, the bass track that was in the files was a DI bass. So all I did was duplicate it, and I added bass amp simulator. This is a UAD Softube one, but you can use any bass amp that you have in your DAW, or you can reamp it with an actual bass amp. Okay, so generally what I would do is I would mix the bass DI to be sort of like the low end, and then the bass amp to be everything else. But in this particular track, the bass DI kind of has a lot of like mid-range information. So I'm actually going to do things backwards than how I'd usually do it. But I'll go ahead and show you what I would normally do if the bass DI didn't have so much mid-range information. So what I would do is I would use a high cut, and I would cut it all the way, everything except everything above 200 hertz, which is a lot of information. And then on my bass sim, I would cut out everything below 200 hertz. Okay, so it's like a crossover point. But like I said, that's not what I'm going to do for this track, because let me go ahead and show you. The bass DI actually has a lot of mid-range information, and when I use the bass simulate, excuse me, the bass amp simulator here, it has a lot of fat, rich, low end. So yeah, let's check that out. Okay, so you can hear what's going on there. The bass DI is a little more, it's hard to describe, kind of more of like a string sound. You can hear the strings a lot. And then the bass amp, well, you get the sound of that virtual speaker pumping out air. So, let's move right along. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the bass DI. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play it with the drums, because this is usually how I would mix a track. I would start with drums and then go to the bass right after that. So yeah, I'm actually going to take the bass amp out for now and just focus on the DI. Okay, so let's check that out. So starting out, I guess I should show what was on here already. So as usual, virtual tape machine. Then going to Neve console emulation. Then a compressor, which actually in the VMR, I've noticed that with R&B tracks, this smooth bass preset works really well. So kind of a medium attack, pretty fast release. Circuit 2, which is sort of a smoother circuit. 2.5 ratio, which is really low. And I'm just getting about 3 dB of compression, then making up pretty much 3 dB. And then I went over here to the 1073 and made a couple tweaks to a preset called Fat Bass. And what Fat Bass does is it takes 80 Hertz and it just cranks it like 9 dB, almost 10. So I dialed that back a little bit because our bass amp is gonna have more low end, so I don't want it to get too muddy. It has a little bit of 3.2. It actually has a high pass filter on it at 36, and I gave it a little bit of drive because sometimes adding some distortion to the bass can make it cut through a little bit better. And this track really is bass and drum oriented. And also, just to get rid of some of that buzziness from the strings, I cut 3.5 dB at 12K. And then just to level match a little bit, use the trimmer. And as far as bass DI, that's it. Okay, so we'll add the bass amp in, and I'll make some changes, and I'll explain what I did after. So as far as the bass amp here, everything's pretty much the same. Just on the tape machine, I used low bias, and then when it came to the 1073 here, I left it with the nearly 10 dB boost and didn't cut any of the highs out of there because it wasn't overbearing, and once again just trimmed it back. And I didn't want it hitting the console so hard, so I dialed it back. Okay, because I don't want whichever bass track I choose to be my low end, which in this case is the bass amp, I don't distort that one. The one that I distort is the bass DI. So that being said, I'm going to add a little bit of distortion here. Okay, so what I did was I added a little bit of preamp distortion. This is a UAD preamp, and this was actually a Universal Audio console, matter of fact. And I just ever so slightly add that in. Sometimes I'll roll off the high end on this, but I don't think it's really needed here. So yeah, adding that distortion will make it cut through a little bit more. And one thing I also have noticed about adding distortion to bass is it'll help your bass come through on like little speakers, like on an iPhone or your smartphone or whatever. So one last thing at the track level that I'm gonna do here that I don't always do, but I think this track can benefit from it. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add an octaver on the bass amp, and I'm gonna do it in parallel so I can mix it in. So name it bass octave, and this is just the stock Cubase one. So since I'm doing it in parallel, I'm gonna take the direct all the way out, and I'll use octave 1 all the way up, and octave 2 means 2 octaves down. So I'll just have that in there ever so slightly just to get some more sub. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with it off, and then I will ever so slightly bring it in. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll bring it all the way down, play it, and then bring it up until I can hear it a little bit, and then bring it back a little bit, because this is going to be something subtle. Okay, so I like it here around -20. So what I'm gonna do is exaggerate it and then bring it back down. Okay, so now the bass is sitting real nice in the track. So sorry about that. So now we'll move on to the bass bus. And in this track I've actually already done a little bit to the bus. So what I do is I have a high pass filter with a very gentle slope. This is 6 dB per octave. And I'm going all the way up to 40, which, if you remember, that's pretty close to what I was high passing at on the track level. So yeah, just making more room for the kick. That's also what I'm doing. Let me get back to it. That's also what I'm doing here with the multi-band compressor. I'm bypassing the low mids, the upper mids, and the high end. And I'm just compressing the low end up to about 100. And what I'm doing is I'm using a side chain, and that side chain is being triggered by the kick out mic. So when the kick hits, it compresses the bass a little bit just to make some room for that kick. And what I also will do more times than not is use a parametric EQ, and I'll do like 3 to 6 dB cut at 60 with a pretty narrow Q, because 60 is usually where I'm boosting in my kick drum. So moving on, there's 2 more little things that I'll do to the bass, and I'll demonstrate that now. Okay, so let me explain that. So on bass guitar, I absolutely love an LA2A, and the emulation that I use most often is the UAD one, but in particular the gray. Just something about the way that this compresses. It's very smooth. It works great on bass, and it imparts subtle distortion that to me just works perfect on bass. So I just get about 2 dB of gain reduction just to sort of glue the 2 bass tracks together. And I turned the gain down because it was adding a little bit of gain. And then from there, I also love the API 550A on bass, and I'm boosting 2 dB at 100 and 2 dB at 800, and just dialed it back. And this is just another plugin where the distortion from this analog emulation just works really, really sweet on bass. So pretty much this is what I always do on my bass bus here. So let's go back to the beginning, and we'll listen to this with the track, and I think you'll hear quite a bit of difference. So you can hear that it's just so much fatter and cutting through. One last thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna solo the bass, and I'll pop all the plugins in and out that we've added here today. And when I do that, the sends will also bypass. So let's check that out. Okay, so that's a huge difference there. Without the plugins, you can hear it's just very stringy and kind of annoying. I mean, the bass playing is excellent. Whoever played bass on this track is a superb bass player. But the track, to me, the bass track is just sort of too bright and not fat enough. To me, it doesn't really even sound like bass that much. So yes, just recap on everything. As usual, virtual tape, some console emulation, compression, EQ. I always use R-Bass because that fattens it up just a little bit. Just use a little bit of it. Mixing is about subtlety. And then whichever one is the higher of the two, I will use some distortion on it. Whichever one's the lowest of the two, sometimes I'll use an octaver. And also you can see that I usually mix in the low end source a little bit higher than the DI, you can see where they were peaking. So this is about -6, this is about -12. So whichever one is the high end, I usually have that about, peaking about 6 dB lower. And then on the bass bus, I make some room for the kick drum there and here. Okay. Sometimes I'll use a sidechain multi-band compressor, which is a very common technique. I'm thinking about making a video specifically on this. LA2A, if you have an emulation of this, I know there are some free emulations of this out there, but if you can get the UAD one or the Waves one, even better. But yeah, this just works really sweet. Optical compressors are perfect on bass and vocals. And then some more EQ, 100 just to add a little bit more low end there. 100 is kind of more above kick drums, so that's why I boost that. 800, that's just a nice mid-range sound, usually on a bass. Sometimes it's a little lower, sometimes it might be even a little higher than that. But I've mixed this track before and I know that 800 works well. And just the way that the API works, the way that the Q is when you boost, it works nice on bass. And of course, with all these analog emulations, they add some harmonic distortion, and the harmonic distortion of these put together just adds a really nice color that gives you some separation from the rest of the tracks. So basically, that's it for today. This is sort of a long video, but you know, I like to try and be thorough in my explanations here. So I hope that you gained something from this, or you learned something new. For you who requested this, I hope that you learned everything that you wanted to learn from this video. So I hope you stick around for some more videos, which are most definitely going to come. I have a couple more ideas for videos. I'm definitely gonna make some videos explaining, you know, the rest of this track, electric guitars, keys, organ, background vocals, and some different types of lead vocal videos, like my vocal spread technique, which I haven't showed yet. Yeah, so if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you didn't, you can go ahead and give it a dislike. That's fine. You are entitled to your opinion, as I always say. And if you really enjoyed this, please subscribe. I've been gaining a few subscribers, and I just have to tell you guys who have been subscribing that I greatly appreciate it, because this is how I learned how to mix, just watching these kind of videos, and I'd really want to be able to help people and have them learn new techniques, or just have a different way of thinking about mixing certain things. And if I could even help one person, then my job is done. And yes, I really wish everybody the best in their mixing. So please stick around for more videos, and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching.